Welcome to the 16th video in our series using 5-inch squares or charm packs. Before we jump into the cutting, I wanted to explain a couple different ways that you could put this pattern together. This one is called Charmed I'm Sure by Moda. For this pattern, once you've cut your squares and made your half square triangle blocks, it tells you to make 10 rows of 10 blocks. I usually make a copy of the piece that I'm doing, and then I highlight the rows as I go, as I sew them, so that I know what I've sewn already. I will also block out the other rows with extra pieces of paper, and that way I can concentrate on the row that I'm working on, and then I just highlight as I go. Each step is easy because I'm only following one particular row. I also label the rows so I can keep them straight when I'm putting the top together. It makes it a lot easier. For this particular project, if you look at it, it has two halves that are the same. So when you put the two halves on top of each other, they're going to be the same thing. So then you just have to make 2 rows each of 5 different rows. Making 2 rows that match at the same time will help speed things up a little bit. Once you've made your 2 halves of 5 rows, you flip one of them on top of the other, and then you put the whole thing together. For me personally, I like to break it down a little bit more and make matching sets of blocks to sew. I'm going to cut this out in an unequal 9-patch sort of look. So what I'll end up with is 4 corners, 4 sides, and 1 center star. Once I get them cut out and stacked, you'll see that the 4 corners all have the same pieces, the 4 sides all have the same pieces, and there's only one section that's different from the rest, and that's the center star. I'm going to make a little road map for myself to follow. I'm going to tape one each of these sections to a piece of paper and write Make 4 behind the corner unit, the side unit, and then write Make 1 behind the star unit. So now, instead of having to keep track of 10 different rows or 2 sets of 5 different rows, I just have 3 sections to keep track of: the side units, the corner units, and the star units. Now that that's decided, it's time to cut. From the background fabric, cut 3 strips that are 5 inches by the width of fabric. You will also need to cut 5 strips that are 4.5 inches by the width of fabric. From the 5-inch strips, cut 20 squares that measure 5 inches by 5 inches. From the 4.5-inch strips, cut 4 rectangles that are 4.5 inches by 16.5 inches, and then you will need to cut 24 squares that are 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. For this part, I have 3 strips that are stacked, so I'm cutting on the 18-inch line, the 13.5-inch line, the 9-inch line, and the 4.5-inch line. Each stack will have 6 squares for a total of 24 squares that are 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. From your charm pack, you need to pick 24 squares for the half square triangle units. I picked all the darkest fabrics for these. And then you need to find 16 squares and trim them to 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. I've chosen the Animal Park Fun Charm Pack by Stacy Ishu, but any charm pack would work for this project. You can check out our website, thequiltedforest.com, for our current selection of charm packs. We will leave a link in the description below. Now it's time to start sewing. Start with all 20 of the background squares and 20 of the charm squares that are all 5 inch by 5 inch. Draw a line corner to corner on the wrong side of all 20 of the background squares. Sew a seam a 1/4 inch away from that center line on both sides of the line. Or, if you prefer, you can use diagonal seam tape to have a guide to follow. Make sure that when you're putting squares together that you have right sides together. Make sure you sew on both sides of the center line. Once you finish sewing on both sides of that center line, you can cut on the line to get 2 half-square triangle blocks. You can cut them apart with either a scissors or with your rotary cutter. I usually will use my rotary cutter to cut these apart unless there's only a few to do, then I will choose the scissors. At this point, you have 4 charm squares left over. Use the same technique to make 4 half-square triangle blocks using just charm fabric. Now it's time to press all of the half-square triangle units. Press towards the charm square fabrics. I'm going to flip all of my half-square triangle blocks so that the dark fabric is on top. That way, when I pick it up, I can easily press to the dark fabric. I also like to stack a few on top of each other, and then I can move the whole stack out of the way at once and start a new stack. Now it's time to trim all of these pieces down to 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. I like to use my block lock ruler because the seam fits in the channel and makes it easy to keep track of where that diagonal line is. Since I've started using the block lock ruler, when I'm trimming these kinds of blocks, my blocks are a lot more accurate. I know they're more expensive than regular rulers without a channel, but in my opinion, they're well worth the cost. Now that the half-square triangle blocks are made and trimmed, and all the rest of the pieces are cut, it's time to start putting our sections together. Make sure to use 1/4 inch seam allowances throughout. I'm just going to work on one section at a time. I'm going to start with the side section. The center part shows that you're sewing 4 background squares together, but we actually cut one rectangle that's 4.5 inches by 16.5 inches, so you're going to save yourself a lot of sewing there. We're going to start by sewing 4 squares together that'll be part of that side unit. Make 4 of these units that have 4 charm squares that have been trimmed to 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches together. Next, we're going to sew these flying geese units. So those are 2 half-square triangle blocks sewn together. Make 8 of those units. Combine these into sets of 2 to get a row that has 2 flying geese units. Make 4 of these. Now it's time to press. Since we're sewing this to a rectangle, it doesn't matter which direction the seams go, so you can press these seams to one side or you can press the seams open. The long rectangle made from 4 squares can also be pressed to one side or pressed open if you prefer. Now we're going to sew those 2 sections onto opposite sides of the center rectangle. Once the 4 side sections have been sewn together, it's time to press. We're going to press towards that center rectangle. Now it's time to work on the 4 corner pieces. I'm going to lay this out according to the diagram, and then I'll be sewing 3 rows of 3 blocks. This particular charm pack had enough duplicate charms that I could make the 4 corners all exactly the same. Another way I could have gone is to have 2 different corner pieces that mirrored each other, or to have all 4 corners of just one of the fabrics. There are a lot of ways you could play around with the design just to make it a little bit different. For ease of piecing, I decided to make all 4 corners exactly alike. For making the rows and following the diagram, I'm just going to make one of the rows at a time. The triangles in the very corner should point towards each other. The inner triangles should point away from each other. For pressing all of these rows, you're going to press towards the background squares. Lay the rows out according to the diagram, double check that the points are all facing the way that they're supposed to, and then start sewing the rows together. To press the corner units, press away from the center row. Now it's time to make the center star square. We'll start by sewing the pieces for the windmill at the very center. Make 2 star point units that will go on opposite sides of the center windmill piece. And finally, we will make 2 star point rows that will have star points in the center with background squares on the ends. And now it's time to press. Lay out the center according to the diagram and then press seams in opposite directions so that when you sew those 4 units together, the seam should nest. Press the star point units towards the background squares. Sew the 4 center pieces together in their proper order. The seams should nest together, and just make sure you double check that you're sewing it to the right side as you go along. You'll press the outer seams towards the center seam, and then you'll press the center seam open. Pressing the center seam open will reduce bulk at the very center of the quilt top. Sew the star point rows to opposite sides of the center section. Press away from the center of the block. Now that all the sections of our quilt are put together, it's time to lay it out on the design floor or your design wall, and then sew the rows together. The quilt top went together so quickly and easily, I will definitely be making this one again. I also love that it's only 1 charm pack combined with a background fabric, and could easily be made from scrap fabrics. Now that the quilt top is done, we can layer it with our batting and backing to get it ready to quilt. I'm going to use a fusible batting and fuse it to the wrong side of the backing fabric. Make sure to properly identify the fusible side of the batting and then put it next to the backing fabric, the wrong side of the backing fabric. And then flip it over so you can press it from the backing side and then press from the center out to get a nice flat surface. Once it's properly fused into place, turn it over and then attach the quilt top to the batting. My favorite product for spray basting is 505 spray. But you could also pin baste, use your favorite method to attach the quilt top to the batting. I will usually press it 1 more time just to make sure everything is nice and flat. I will press it from the front and then the back, and then I'll check it again on the front to make sure I haven't put in any creases. The finished size of this quilt top is 40.5 inches by 40.5 inches, so I'm just going to quilt this on my domestic sewing machine. I'll attach my walking foot and then stitch in the ditch with matching thread. I sewed along all of the straight lines and then all of the lines that were on a diagonal. Using my walking foot, I attached the binding cut from 2.5-inch strips to the back side of the quilt and then flip it around and top stitch it on the front. This will be the perfect quilt or wall hanging for a baby. We sure hope that you enjoyed the video. Make sure to give us a thumbs up if you liked the video, leave a comment for us, share with your quilting friends, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and happy quilting!